I think it's always important to talk within a context. And although the topic tonight that I'm going to speak about is patient-doctor communication side by side, and I've been involved in that program for the last 14 years. But I'd like to give you some background first. In 1975, breast cancer was considered a death sentence. And when I self-examined and felt a little something, I went for a mammogram. And I'm going to give you some examples of poor communication and good communication. This is how I was told about cancer. I really knew nothing about it. I had read an article that said, after you examine your breast, if you feel something, and you raise your arm, and there is a wrinkling or a dimpling, it might very well be malignant. So I went for the mammogram, and a young doctor examined me. He said, "Oh, I can hardly feel anything." And I raised my arm. He said, "Wait, I'll get another doctor." And he got a senior doctor into the room. I saw the doctor. He looked at me. He saw. This is what he said. "Well, I'm afraid you are going to need a radical mastectomy." I was dumbfounded. I didn't know what he was talking about. I knew what a mastectomy was. That's what they were doing then. When he said a radical mastectomy, I thought it was a political party. I had no idea what that meant. But I knew he thought I had breast cancer. So I went into the ladies' room and cried by myself because he said it so matter-of-factly. Well, I went to the hospital. I had a radical mastectomy, the breast, the nose, chest muscle, the whole thing. And in those days, in 75, you stayed in the hospital for a longer time. You know, they didn't just send you home. And I remember one day a doctor with a few, I think, residents or maybe third-year medical students was standing outside of my room, and I could hear them. They were discussing my case. And they referred to me as the radical mastectomy in room 223. I didn't feel very good about that. And when they came in, I said to the doctor, "If you want to talk about my illness, I'd like you to talk to me about it too. And I'm not the radical mastectomy in room 223. I'm a woman, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a counselor." He said, "Oh, please," he said, "it's just a shortcut." All right, I didn't have much chance beyond that. I wasn't sophisticated about anything. You sort of learn the hard way. So even though I had the support of my family, and I felt my poor husband, he was married to me 5 years, this was my second marriage, I thought the poor guy got cheated. You know, here he marries me and now I have breast cancer. It was hard. The loss of a breast was hard. It was embarrassing. I felt ashamed. Ultimately, of course, I got a, what do you call them? You know, what you put in. What do you call that again? No, I had no reconstruction. A prosthesis, thank you. I blocked that out. I remember even when I went to the incinerator in my building, I made sure to wear it because I was very self-conscious at the beginning. And even though you had friends and family, well-meaning, concerned, also thinking you might die, my very best friend said, "Oh, Lee, listen, you can cross the street and get hit and killed." I said, "I'd rather cross the street without breast cancer." But she was trying to be helpful. 1 year later, Dr. Eugene Thiessen, a breast specialist, who, by the way, worked at NYU many years ago, decided that women needed other women to talk to about this. And he began a group. And originally, he was starting to see 20 years old, women in their 20s with breast cancer, which was unusual. And it was advertised over the radio, et cetera. And when I heard the announcement, I wanted to go to a support group. But I called. I said, I'm not in my 20s. Is it okay if I come? And they said, of course. It was August 1976. I remember the first meeting. 12 of us sat in a circle. He was there. He was, by the way, very gorgeous and a little distracting, but he was wonderful. His wife was there making coffee for us. But you know, we were so self-conscious and it was so private that at the end of the meeting, the women decided, we don't want anyone in this room who hasn't had breast cancer. That's how we felt about it. Did you want to? Oh, you raised your hand. You can ask me, I'll be through it a while. Anyway, that's how Share started. We sat in the circle, we looked at each other, and we began to discuss how we felt, things we had not shared with anybody else. And tears filled our eyes because for the first time, we felt understood. And that's how Share began. We began to value our experience. And we said, experience is our expertise. We are not doctors. We don't give medical advice. But we can talk about a lot of other things. And so Share got started, gradually building up many, many programs. 14 years ago, when Share, by this time, had many different programs, one of the women said, you know, we're always talking about empowerment. What does empowerment mean? So we sat down to figure out what does it mean. And we came to the conclusion, I hate this microphone. If you don't hear me, raise your hand, I'll go back to it. What is it? And I should use it. Okay. What does empowerment mean? How can we feel more empowered? And we decided communication with our doctors, being able to express ourselves during the medical interview, having our doctors understand from us how it feels to be told you have cancer. And so we began very slowly. And I have to admit to this, at the very beginning, so much anger was expressed at doctors because sometimes very validly, because information was given in a poor way. And also, sometimes we were blaming the messenger and we were just angry that we were sick. And so we discussed all these things and we began to have meetings with doctors. And the first meeting we had was a doctor had to arrange it. And he was very enthusiastic. And do you know why? He said his sister had ovarian cancer. And it was, I think, stage 3 or 4 perhaps. And the doctor called to give her some test results. She was working. He called her on the phone, and this is what he said. I'm sorry to tell you, your numbers have gone up, meaning your cancer is getting worse. The chemo is no longer helping you. So you need to start thinking about plans. Do you know what she did? There was a garbage pail near her, and she threw up in the garbage pail. And when that happened to his sister, he said, thank you to all of us. There were about 20 doctors and about 10 Share people sharing the communication issues that we had. I'm going to mention some of the things we came up with, and they're hints and clues that hopefully patients will use. Remember, it is your body. Always in the past, and certainly with my mother, I remember, doctors were put on pedestals. They were like God. My mother always told me to have clean underwear on, although I did anyway, in case I had an accident or something. Really, that's true. And there is a doctor who once said, when doctors get off their pedestals, patients will get off their knees. But the opposite is also true. And so what we were aiming for was an equal kind of relationship, a relationship where we trusted our doctors. And some of us had very good doctors. And it took us a while. We had to get a lot out of our systems until we began to recognize, well, doctors are human. We have to let them know how we feel, but we want to know, how do they feel? And so we began our meetings. We met with medical students first, second year, third year medical students, different hospitals, mainly NYU. This hospital has always been so cooperative and so willing to improve communication. And I think our two doctors tonight exemplify that. But, you know, things happen in an interview. And so sometimes the doctor uses phrases, medical phrases, and you don't know what he or she is talking about. And you might feel embarrassed to not understand, you know. Or they're very busy, and we know they are really busy. But whatever time there is, let's say it's 18 or 20 minutes, you can use that 18 minutes in a very fruitful way. And the patient and the doctor both know. The patient notices, is the doctor really listening? They're busy, they might be at the computer, or they get a phone call. And I will tell you, even recently, and this is 36 years after my own experience, I was seeing my own internist, whom I liked very much. And my friend recommended him to me because he taught communication when he was a younger doctor. Well, they moved to a new office and everybody got a nice new laptop. And after the examination, which was, you know, not a lot of statistics or anything, he was sitting at the new laptop, and when he looked up and saw my face, he said, "I hear you." I went home that night and I said to myself, what a hypocrite you are. You work with doctors and patients and you don't speak up when you feel something's wrong. So the next time when I visited him again, I asked if he would please close his door. And he did. And he looked at me and I said, "You remember last time when I saw you?" He said, "Yes." "And you said, 'I hear you'?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Hearing is not listening." And he went like this for a long time. And then he looked up at me and said, "I apologize. It will never happen again." So for me, I have such respect for him and for admitting it. Now, I'm hoping he doesn't do it with other patients. I can't swear to that. But his apology meant a lot to me because he understood it. Now, I'd like to, if I may, give you some learnings, you might say, that we got as patients and survivors. Patients, before you see the doctor, have a list of questions and prioritize them. The first 3 should be your most special concerns, because you may not have time during the interview to get them all answered. And you can make arrangements with the doctor, you know, to find out sometimes through email or a phone call or even another visit. But get your first important concerns dealt with. And when you don't understand, don't be embarrassed to say, "Could you please explain that? I don't quite know that or get it." The doctor won't think you're silly. in fact, should appreciate that you're asking, because if you don't ask and you don't know, you're wasting your time and his or her time, because then you don't know what to do about treatment or anything else. Bring a friend or a family member with you for support sometimes. And when at first you get bad news, your whole mind is in a muddle. You may not even be able to read your questions. So take someone you trust, and that person can even write down the answers, that were given. Be honest about all the relevant information. They make jokes in psychotherapy. A patient will come and talk to you for an hour, and on the way out, they'll say, oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, I always took a lot of cocaine, or some other important thing that, by the way, they didn't mention. Now, we might feel ashamed of some things, or that we had AIDS, or this, or anything that might embarrass us, and we don't tell it, we don't confide it. And all these things can be very relevant, and it's up to the doctor to fit it into the entire understanding and the plan. If you don't trust your doctor, you really have a hollow relationship, especially if you have something chronic where you're going to be seeing the doctor for a long time. And you know what? You're allowed to change your doctor. I've heard many people at Share even say, it's very embarrassing. I really don't like my doctor, but I don't know how to say that. We have found that many doctors, when they see that the patient isn't quite sure of the diagnosis or the treatment, and it's not a reflection of the doctor, they suggest, why don't you get a second opinion? And that's very respected. Very respected. The nonverbal language is very important. Doctors look at us, they see expressions, we look at them, and we pick up a lot. Sometimes they don't seem interested in us, we think. Or sometimes with seniors, we've now incorporated seniors, meaning over 65, in our groups with doctors, because each group has special things. One of the things was, as you get older, generally speaking, your hearing begins to diminish. If the doctor turns around and you don't quite hear, or if you don't quite hear anyway when the doctor's speaking to you, you might be embarrassed to ask the doctor to keep repeating it. So the doctor needs to know, I'm having a little hearing difficulty, if you could speak up. What's interesting is that the feedback we get from our meetings teaches us a lot. At the end of our meeting with the seniors, one of the complaints the senior women had was that some doctors seem condescending to them. It reminds them of grandma, or, some relative who's older, and maybe they feel this relative doesn't keep up with things, etc. Well, the doctor came over to me and he said, that's true, but it's also true that seniors are also very condescending to us because we're young and we look young. And I said, you're absolutely right. That's true. I've heard many women say, my God, he's so young. How could he know anything? No, not realizing that they have been getting all the current information in medicine. And some of them, I'm not saying the older doctors don't know it, but certainly the younger ones do. And this whole relationship-centered care that we talk about, that's a result in the last few years. It's a buzzword now. It's a thing of the future. I learned recently, to my surprise, that in several states, including New York, when the medical students take their boards, there's a portion on that test of patient-doctor communication. And if they don't pass that part, they do not pass the board. we've come a long way, I think. A very long way for that to even happen. Now, there are things, some suggestions we have made to doctors. Allow the patient to express herself. Be attentive and empathic. Use appropriate language. You know, there's also the problem of ethnic diversity, and the problem is that those with a different language or from a different group have a much more difficult time. It's hard enough to try to understand your treatment and what's required, and when you take a test, when do you get the results? How do you find a good doctor? All of that. Suppose you don't speak the language. Being an interpreter is not really enough. It's a literal interpretation of English. At Share, we have a patient navigator because we have a very developed Latina program. The patient navigator herself has had cancer. Our particular navigator has had chemotherapy, and she's doing very well. And she's been trained. We do some training at Share. So she works with the patient. She goes into the examining room with the patient. She works with breast cancer patients. And so when the doctor says something, she doesn't just say, the doctor said A, B, C. She fills it out. She helps the patient understand what the treatment might involve. And recently, one of the patient navigators told me a story. A woman found a lump, and she was told she needed a biopsy. She said, under no conditions, I will not have a biopsy. I don't want to be cut. And she was absolutely determined not to, even though her family begged her to. Well, the patient navigator talked to her and explained to her why it was important. And finally she said, if you go for the biopsy, I will be there with you. The woman considered going. But what happened is that very day, when she was going to have the biopsy, the navigator wasn't in the hospital. Something else had occurred where she couldn't be there, and the woman walked out. Well, you can imagine how the navigator felt. So they made another appointment. She explained to the patient why she couldn't be there. And she went with her, and the patient did it. She had a Bible in one hand and the navigator's hand in the other, and she had her biopsy. And she did have cancer, but she's doing okay. And she said to the navigator, maybe you're saving my life. Without you, I wouldn't have done this. So there are a lot of empathic things, compassionate things that we want to do, that we can do if we try. I want to make sure I'm not leaving out anything. Oh, difficult patient situations. It's hard for the doctor. Doctors generally go into medicine because they want to help people. They want to make people better, and that cannot always be. And sometimes you have a patient you know is terminal. Is there any good way to tell a patient you have cancer or chemo is no longer working? Just the news itself. But there are things not to do. Sometimes we learn what not to do when it's very difficult to know what to do. And what you need to do is let the patient know you're there with her, and that there are other things that together, if there's a new clinical trial that comes up, we will investigate it. And the patient and you are partners in searching for ways at least to make her feel better right now. So it's not easy to have to do that, but many times it does. We talk about at Share, one of our expressions is candor with hope. In other words, don't lie to your patient. And I don't think the doctors do. They do tell them this is the problem. But just telling the problem doesn't give them any hope. And when I mentioned at the very beginning the way I was told I needed a radical mastectomy, period, there was nothing encouraging or anything about that. And I remember that Sunday, I was making a graduation party for my son. And I hadn't told him about this yet because I was going in for a biopsy a few days later. I didn't want to spoil his party. But that morning I woke up crying because inside I knew I must have cancer. So on a Sunday, I called the oncologist, the surgeon, breast surgeon, who was going to do the surgery. And I was crying and I said, I feel so worried, I don't know what to do. He said, look, until we do the biopsy, we cannot be certain. That statement carried me through the party. And ironically, 20 years later, the same doctor who had said, I'm afraid you're going to need a radical mastectomy, gave a speech at Share. He learned a lot in those 20 years, I'll tell you. But at the end of his speech, I went over to him and I said, you probably don't remember me, and I told him my name. Of course he's not going to remember me. I said, but I saw you in 1975, and you told me, I'm afraid you're going to need a radical mastectomy. He said, I never said that. He knew by now that would be lousy communication, and maybe he really forgot. And I said, when you get a diagnosis of cancer, you do not forget it. And that was it.